1937, the German government rounded up 385 mixed-race teenagers, some as young as 11 years old, and forcibly sterilized them to prevent what they called racial contamination. These children, born to German mothers and black African fathers, had been living normal lives, going to school, playing with friends, until the day Nazi officials showed up with lists, medical instruments, and a surgical plan to ensure they could never have children. This was not happening in some remote concentration camp. This was happening in hospitals across the Rhineland, while neighbors watched, teachers knew, and nobody stopped it. By the end, you'll understand how an entire community of Afro-Germans was systematically erased from German society, and why their story remained buried for over 50 years after the war ended. Let's start with something most people don't know. There were black people living in Germany long before the Nazis came to power. In the 18th century, German colonists and missionaries in Africa married local women or had children with them. And when Germany lost its African colonies after World War I, some of those families returned to Germany. By the time the Nazis took control in 1933, there were somewhere between 20,000 Azars and 25,000 black people living in Germany out of a total population of over 65 million. That's a tiny number, but it was enough to trigger a massive campaign of persecution that would destroy countless lives. But here's where the real hysteria began, and it had everything to do with World War I and what happened after Germany lost. Under the Treaty of Versailles, France occupied the Rhineland region in western Germany starting in 1918, and about 5,000 of the French troops stationed there were black colonial soldiers recruited from Senegal, Morocco, Algeria, Madagascar, and French territories in Asia. German nationalists absolutely lost their minds. They saw black soldiers on German soil as a deliberate humiliation, a national disgrace that threatened the purity of the German race. Racist propaganda spread everywhere, portraying African men as sexual predators targeting innocent white German women. When some of these French African soldiers formed relationships with local German women and had children, race fanatics went into full panic mode. Between 1919 and 1930, roughly 600 to 800 mixed-race children were born in the Rhineland during the occupation. The German press immediately started calling them Rhineland bastards, a derogatory term that combined racial slurs with accusations of illegitimacy. Adolf Hitler himself wrote about these children in Mein Kampf, claiming that Jews had deliberately brought black soldiers to Germany as part of a conspiracy to bastardize the white race and destroy German civilization. This was pure racist paranoia, but it became official Nazi ideology once they took power. Here's what's important to understand. These children weren't treated as a problem that needed solving until the Nazis decided to make them one. During the Weimar Republic before Hitler came to power, most of these mixed-race kids had German citizenship through their unmarried German mothers. They went to school, they had friends, they lived relatively normal lives, even though they faced discrimination. But when the Nazis took control in 1933, everything changed. The regime was obsessed with racial purity, and these children represented everything they despised: evidence of race mixing, proof that black people existed in Germany, and a supposed threat to the future of the Aryan race. On September 15, 1935, the Nazis passed the Nuremberg Laws, which were primarily designed to target Jews, but quickly expanded to include black people and Roma. The Reich citizenship law stated that only people of German or related blood could be full citizens, which immediately stripped non-Aryans of political rights. The law for the protection of German blood and German honor banned marriages and sexual relationships between Germans and anyone considered racially inferior. For Afro-Germans, this meant they could not legally marry German citizens, which was the Nazi way of ensuring they couldn't have children and pass on what the regime saw as contaminated bloodlines. But the Nazis didn't stop at legal discrimination. They wanted to make absolutely certain that Afro-Germans could never reproduce, and that's where forced sterilization became official policy. In the summer of 1933, before the Nuremberg laws were even passed, the Nazis had already introduced the law for the prevention of offspring with hereditary diseases, which authorized forced sterilization of people with disabilities. Between 1933 and 1945, roughly 400,000 people were sterilized under this law. But in 1937, the Nazis decided to use that same law as cover for targeting the Rhineland bastards, even though there was absolutely no legal basis for sterilizing people, solely because of their race. A secret Gestapo committee was set up specifically to handle the Rhineland children. Racial anthropologists, including a man named Wolfgang Abel, who worked at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, compiled detailed lists of mixed-race children living in the Rhineland. In July 1933, Abel had examined 39 children in Wiesbaden, taking photographs and measurements, claiming he found all sorts of degenerative traits like tooth decay and mental deficiencies. His conclusion was that nearly all of the children were subnormal and represented a danger to German racial purity. His findings were published by the Racial Political Office in 1934, and officials used them to justify mass sterilization. By 1937, the Gestapo had identified 385 mixed-race teenagers for sterilization. The youngest victim was an 11-year-old girl. These children were taken from their homes, brought to hospitals, and forcibly sterilized, often without anesthesia. Hans Horch, one of the few victims who later spoke publicly about what happened to him, was the son of a white German mother and an Algerian father. He was taken to a clinic, given an unauthorized vasectomy without pain relief, and then forced to sign a document stating the procedure was voluntary and that he would never have sexual or romantic relations with people of German heritage. The sterilization left him physically and psychologically traumatized for the rest of his life. Another victim was Marion Braun, whose father was a French colonial African soldier. She was admitted to a state hospital and sterilized on June 3, 1937. Historians estimate that between 385 and 800 Afro-German children were sterilized in total, though the exact number remains unknown because the program was conducted in secret and many records were destroyed. What we do know for certain is that none of these victims ever received compensation from the German government after the war, and the doctors and officials who carried out the sterilizations were never prosecuted. But sterilization wasn't the only form of persecution Afro-Germans faced under Nazi rule. Black children were excluded from schools starting in 1941, banned from joining the Hitler Youth or the League of German Maidens, and subjected to special courses in race science designed to humiliate them and reinforce their supposed inferiority. Afro-German adults lost their jobs, were evicted from apartments, and faced constant harassment from neighbors and authorities. Some were arrested and sent to concentration camps. Others were used as guinea pigs in medical experiments or killed under the T4 euthanasia program, which murdered nearly 300,000 people with disabilities between 1939 and 1945. One well-known victim was Hilarius Gilges, a black German dancer and communist activist who was murdered by Nazi thugs in June 1933, just months after Hitler came to power. His body was left on the street as a warning. Another was Ferdinand Alchin, who had a black British father and a white German mother. He was forcibly sterilized by court order on May 15, 1941, and later murdered at Hadamar Psychiatric Facility as part of the T4 program. During World War II, Afro-Germans faced additional dangers. Some were forcibly conscripted into the German military, despite the Compulsory Service Act of 1935 restricting military service to Aryans only. There are documented cases of Afro-German men who were forced to be sterilized before being drafted. Black prisoners of war captured by German forces faced brutal treatment. While there was no official policy ordering their execution, some German commanders separated black soldiers from captured units and shot them on their own initiative. This happened to African soldiers fighting for France and to captured African American soldiers from the US Army. What makes this entire historical episode even more disturbing is how thoroughly it was covered up after the war. When Nazi Germany finally collapsed in 1945, international attention focused overwhelmingly on the genocide of 6 million Jews, which was absolutely the central tragedy of the Holocaust and deserved that focus. But the persecution of Afro-Germans was barely mentioned. The sterilization victims received no reparations. The doctors who performed forced surgeries went unprosecuted. The officials who compiled the lists and coordinated the roundups faced no consequences. For decades, Afro-Germans who survived the Nazi era were told their stories didn't matter, that what happened to them wasn't important enough to remember or acknowledge. It wasn't until 1979 that the first academic study on the Rhineland bastards was even published. It took another decade before historians began seriously researching what had happened to Afro-Germans during the Nazi period. And it wasn't until the 1990s that survivors like Hans Horch started giving public interviews about their experiences. By then, most of the victims had already died without ever receiving recognition or compensation for what had been done to them. Here's something that needs to be said clearly. This erasure of Afro-Germans from German society didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't just the work of a few fanatical Nazis. It required cooperation from doctors, teachers, landlords, employers, neighbors, and ordinary German citizens who watched these policies unfold and either participated actively or stayed silent. The sterilizations happened in public hospitals. The school exclusions happened with teachers who knew these children. The job firings happened with employers who made the choice to dismiss black workers. This was a society-wide effort to remove black people from German life, and it succeeded largely because most Germans either supported it or didn't care enough to resist. But Afro-Germans didn't just passively accept this persecution. Throughout the Nazi era and after the war, they fought back in whatever ways they could. During the Weimar Republic in the 1920s and 1930s, black communities organized protests against discriminatory laws like the ban on interracial marriage. Some engaged in civil disobedience, refusing to comply with racist regulations, even though doing so put them at enormous risk. After the war, Afro-German activists used legal action to challenge the government's refusal to grant them full citizenship rights and compensation for Nazi-era persecution. Cultural resistance also played a crucial role. Black German jazz musicians like Louis Armstrong, who performed in Germany during the 1930s and 1940s, became symbols of resistance against Nazi cultural censorship. The regime had banned jazz music as degenerate Negro art, but people kept listening to it anyway, and black performers kept creating despite enormous pressure to stop. That cultural defiance helped preserve a sense of identity and community even during the worst years of persecution. In more recent decades, Afro-Germans have continued fighting for recognition. Memorial plaques called Stolpersteine, which translate to stumbling stones, have been dedicated to black victims of Nazi persecution and murder. These small brass plaques are embedded in sidewalks outside the last known addresses of victims, forcing people to literally stumble upon the memory of what happened. The Amadeu Antonio Foundation, named after an Afro-German activist murdered by neo-Nazis in 1992, works to combat racism and xenophobia in modern Germany. So where does this leave us now? Germany today has a much larger Afro-German population than it did in the 1930s, concentrated in cities like Berlin, Frankfurt, Hamburg, Munich, and Cologne. Modern immigration and refugee flows have brought substantial African communities to Germany, but the legacy of Nazi persecution still shapes how Afro-Germans experience life in Germany. Racism persists, discrimination in housing and employment continues, and the historical erasure of what happened during the Nazi era means many Germans still don't know this history, even though it's part of their own national past. The story of the Rhineland bastards and the broader persecution of Afro-Germans under Nazi Chadi rule is a reminder that racial violence doesn't always look like gas chambers and mass shootings. Sometimes it looks like forced sterilization conducted in hospitals by doctors. Sometimes it looks like school exclusions enforced by teachers. Sometimes it looks like job firings carried out by employers. And sometimes it looks like an entire community being systematically erased while the world watches and does nothing. That's what happened to Afro-Germans between 1933 and 1945, and their story deserves to be remembered not as a footnote to the Holocaust, but as a central example of how racial ideology, when embraced by a state and society, can destroy lives with brutal efficiency